There we go. Uh, in addition to my friend Calvin here's astute observation, I'll throw in a related observation from the book No Plot, No Problem by Chris Beatty, the founder of National Novel Writing Month, or NaNoWriMo, an event that goes on every November. Beatty asserts that the secret weapon you need to write a novel, quote, is the most awesome catalyst that's ever been unleashed on the worlds of art and commerce. Nearly every beautiful and useful thing you've ever touched or witnessed was born in its mighty forge. It's portable, affordable, and non polluting. It's also invisible. What you need to write a novel, of course, is a deadline. And at least for me, that also applies to sermons. Uh, One more disclaimer. I have that book because a couple of years ago I thought about participating in NaNoWriMo. I haven't actually done that, and I haven't written a novel. Maybe this will be the year. Who knows? I don't really have a deadline for that. And while I'm going off on tangents about deadlines, many years ago at a technical society meeting out at the AEDC Officers Club, I met a gentleman who somehow ended up talking philosophy with me and who observed that mortality was a good thing because without that ultimate and literal deadline, we'd never have any incentive to get anything done. Somehow that conversation stuck with me. Years later, when I discovered the Tullahoma UU Church, I realized that the gentleman I'd been talking with was Reverend Don Mayle, the first minister of and the driving force behind what was originally the UU Fellowship of Tullahoma. And yet another disclaimer. I might be rehashing some stuff from earlier talks, but if so, it's because I think it bears repeating. In particular, I did a talk in June called May You Live in Interesting Times. That was actually our first Zoom service, covering some of the same ground. I deliberately did not go back and reread that one before writing this one because a lot has changed since then, and I didn't want what I wrote in June to color what I was going to say today. It probably will anyway. What sparked this particular talk is that we, both the United States and the world as a whole, seem to be at or near a cusp, a singularity, an inflection point of some kind in many ways. Almost as if the whole world is holding its breath, waiting to see which way things go. Earlier this year, I thought it felt like there was a palpable sense of anxiety pervading the country, like something in the air. It's only gotten worse since then. Whoops, that didn't come out right. There's supposed to be, for whatever reason, that slide's not showing up right. There's supposed to be a blue bowl underneath this ball here. So just imagine there's a blue bowl there. I don't know what happened to the slide. Imagine a perfectly symmetric inverted bowl or a hill with the perfectly symmetric ball that we've managed to roll right up to the tippy top. We know it's going to roll down the hill with the first tiny nudge, but we have no idea which direction it's going to end up going. Here's where we are at this particular point in history. This is where we are at this particular point in history, at this cusp, with respect to the COVID-19 pandemic, with respect to the US and the global economy, primarily because of the pandemic, with respect to our national political outlook and its global consequences, with respect to civil rights, especially in light of changes in the Supreme Court, with respect to climate change and energy sources, with respect to civil unrest and political polarization in the United States, which could threaten the long-term survival of the Republic and have far-reaching effects on global power structures. It sounds scary. It is scary. We can, of course, plan ahead when we're pretty sure things in the world around us are going to go pretty well. But we can also plan ahead even when we know things are likely to get worse. What's difficult is planning ahead or even finding any peace of mind when we have no idea what we can reasonably expect the world to look like in 6 months or a year or 2 years. I have to start off with the COVID-19 picture. The COVID-19 pandemic is, of course, affecting every other aspect of life in America. I haven't sent out an analysis update lately for various reasons, but mostly because I've been too busy. I have been tracking the numbers all along, though. Here is the history of average cases per day updated through yesterday. What sparked this talk when I came up with the title was that we were about right here at the end of September, and we're just barely starting to trend up. Our transmission rate, the number of new infections from each current infection, was right around 1, which meant that a little bump in either direction would mean a major change in the outlook. Since then, though, we have definitely moved in the wrong direction, and our transmission rate is now around 1.17 by my own estimate. We have most definitely not rounded the corner. We are in for a long, dreary winter. Even if the transmission rate stops going up, if we don't take action to mitigate the spread and the transmission rate stays where it is, here's where it leads: to a peak of around 600,000 cases per day in late March, when herd immunity starts to kick in. And that's just a halfway point or so. As we have failed to learn twice now, here and here, reaching a peak doesn't mean you're out of the woods. It means you're at the deepest and scariest part of the woods. Without additional mitigation, let's see, I got my slides in the wrong order. Well, let me back up one. Yeah, this was the 7-day moving average of cases. This is the 7-day moving average of deaths. There is, because there's a lag between diagnosis and death, that's roughly around 11 days now. It didn't look like the death rate was going up until right here, a week after, or 11 days, almost exactly 11 days after the case total started going up. So the death toll is probably going to keep moving up. So the projected deaths per day to go in that scenario are, or as currently projected, goes up to almost over 9,000 per day in late March. The total number of cases, as we go past the peak and wind back down, we end up at about 110 million cases. And 1.75 million deaths late next year. Now that's if nothing else. That's if nothing changes, and things will change, but we don't know how or what, how or which direction. Or so just to explain, here's how herd immunity works. Say you have thousands of people milling around in a great big room, and one of them has a communicable virus. She gets too close to 10 people and infects 5 of them. Each of those people gets close to 10 other people and infects 5 of them. At first, while there are a lot of people who haven't been sick yet, the virus spreads nearly exponentially. But after a while, assuming that those who've had the disease now have immunity, more and more of the people in contact with a sick person are already immune, so only 4 of them get it, then 3, then 2. The immune survivors act almost exactly like control rods in a nuclear reactor, interrupting the transmission chain and preventing a runaway chain reaction. Theoretically, the virus eventually won't be able to find enough new hosts to spread, even before everybody in the room's been sick, and it will indeed magically disappear. The lower the initial or basic transmission rate, the lower the percentage of the population who have to get the disease to eliminate the virus. Things that they don't tell you, at least not loudly enough, about herd immunity. The basic transmission rate is not a fixed property of a virus. It's profoundly affected by our habits, which we can alter on purpose in response to the disease. In the previous example, if each of those folks only gets too close to 4 people instead of 10, they only spread it to 2 instead of 5. Wash their hands and wear masks, and maybe it's only 1 of the 2, and community spread gets nipped in the bud. The concept of herd immunity is meaningless without the immunity part. It simply is not known at this point how long COVID-19 immunity might last, whether people with mild or asymptomatic cases actually acquire immunity, and so on. Unless a vaccine is 100% effective and universally administered, it's unlikely to actually eliminate a virus. It simply lowers the effective transmission rate by turning some people into control rods without their having to get the disease. Less than half of US adults get seasonal flu shots, and their effectiveness is usually well below 100%. But without the vaccines, our influenza epidemics would be much worse than they are. We did manage to eliminate smallpox in the wild, but only with a highly effective vaccine and the political will to enforce near universal distribution of the vaccine. Things they don't tell you about a COVID-19 vaccine, at least not loudly enough. There are indeed several promising vaccines in clinical trials, but it seems unclear how effective they might be. A vaccine that's 60% effective might be very useful in mitigating the spread of the virus, but it's unlikely to convince a vulnerable person that it's okay to hang out in crowds. Even if a vaccine were to be approved by the end of this year, an optimistic goal, it's hard to imagine widespread administration of said vaccine before early spring, which, as you'll recall, would be too late to head off the surge that's currently ramping up. In the real world, herd immunity, whether with or without a vaccine, is unlikely to eliminate COVID-19, largely because the US is not a closed system and our population is not a homogeneous mass of people. There will continue to be flare-ups and hotspots. The other thing they don't tell you loudly enough is that the only smart way to keep those flare-ups small and local is to identify them quickly and then act quickly and firmly to mitigate and contain them, which would require ongoing testing, reporting, and contact tracing. Do I really think we'll hit 600,000 cases per day? Probably not, because it's hard for me to imagine that, for example, if we hit 300,000 per day, as the projection would indicate, by New Year's Day, that we won't impose new restrictions, that the schools will just reopen in January as if nothing new were happening. But we will once again be reactive instead of proactive, acting too late for a lot of Americans. And of course, any new restrictions bring with them economic hardships for a lot of other Americans. But to think we can somehow keep the economy chugging along while the hospitals and morgues are overflowing is a pipe dream anyway. We're really in quite a pickle. It would be nice if we could wake up one day as if from a bad dream to a world free of COVID-19 with everything magically back to the way it was in 2019. But that's not going to happen. Now, let's add to that. We are 9 days from a national election, the outcome of which will have profound implications for the future course of our nation. Although it's not likely to have much impact on the all but inevitable third wave of COVID-19 infections. It is not at all certain that the election results will be clear-cut and accepted. There's a possibility of widespread civil unrest, even insurrection, no matter which way the votes go. Will racial tensions continue to grow, or will we actually find a way to come together in the interest of racial justice and reconciliation? Where will the increasing political polarization in America lead? I fear for the future of the Republic if we can't find a way to come together. From a broader perspective, a fractured America would have profound implications for the entire global balance of power, which is why some other countries are cheering on the polarization in the US. What does the probable impending change in the Supreme Court makeup imply for the future of the Affordable Care Act, for abortion rights, for same-sex marriage rights? Who knows? The US economy is on shaky ground largely, but not solely due to the pandemic, and it's more likely to get worse than better in the near term, regardless of election outcome. What could that mean, not just for struggling Americans in the near term, but for the long-term outlook for younger Americans? The point of all this is to make it clear, if it wasn't already apparent to you, that we are truly at an inflection point in the history of the US and of the world, a point where everything is changing all at once and we have no idea where the chips will fall. Maybe we'll have a better idea in a few weeks, a few months, a year or two, who knows? It is not, believe it or not, my intent to depress you. Uncertainty can be dealt with, but it's not particularly healthy or helpful to deal with it by pretending it isn't there. Even in the best case, the world is not going back to the way it was. It's like I've learned about any other grief or trauma or major life change, good or bad. You don't get over it, you get through it to a new normal on the other side. Even if we come out of this period better in some ways, the road from here to there is going to be bumpy and chaotic. And the world has ever been thus. When life goes along smoothly and predictably for a while, we can lull ourselves into thinking that it's supposed to be that way. But life is change by its very nature. I'm going to go off on another little tangent here. A full 50 years ago, in 1970, Alvin Toffler's bestseller Future Shock was published. I have, for some time, intended to go back and reread Future Shock and maybe do a talk on how well it's held up. I haven't gotten that far yet. Toffler was mostly talking about technological change. What I think most people remember about Future Shock, those few who remember it at all anyway, is some of the gee whiz sorts of technology predictions. But the underlying premise of the book was that change was going to come more and more rapidly, and that there would be profound psychological difficulties in dealing with the pace of change, of living in a world where nothing stays the same for very long. What he called the post-industrial era, we would probably refer to as the information age. But the important point is that we are at a point where technological changes beget more changes in an ever accelerating cycle. One thing I've noticed during the pandemic is that people generally aren't wired to grasp the notion of exponential growth, let alone come to grips with it. We think of change either as a step from one reality to another, or perhaps as a linear process, but we have a hard time internalizing the notion of accelerating change. And I don't think Toffler addressed it specifically, but the ability of pandemics to rapidly spread across the globe, carried, of course, by globe-trotting humans, is arguably a byproduct of all that technological change. I'm bringing up Future Shock in part to point out that in addition to all those other changes, technological change continues unabated. And everything is interconnected. All that technology that connects the world together plays a part in political and social change, and also in the backlash against those changes. But that's way too complicated to dig into today. I can't really tell you how to live with the uncertainty, but I can tell you how I try to deal with it in the hope that you might find something helpful. My first suggestion is to learn to accept that life is uncertain, which of course is a lot more difficult to do than it is to say. It's taken me a lot of Zen meditation practice, mindfulness practice, and reflection to get to that point. The bottom line, a core Zen concept, is impermanence. Nothing, for better or worse, lasts forever. The key to reducing our suffering is learning not to cling to the notion of permanence, to enjoy the good things in your life in the here and now, without agonizing over the possibility that they'll be taken from you, as they will eventually, hopefully way down the road, and also not to despair that the bad things in your life will never change. To endeavor to live every moment fully and deeply because it won't last forever. Then there's Taoist philosophy, which I believe had a lot of influence on Zen. I think Zen was mostly what happened when Indian Buddhism met Chinese Taoism. I don't know as much about Taoism as I'd like. Most of what I do know, I learned from the late Van Kenyon, who was our congregation's resident Taoist. Essentially, it's about learning to go with the flow, to roll with the changes life throws at you. Taoism apparently arose against a backdrop of competing kingdoms and constant wars in China. In other words, at a time when life was marked by uncertainty. Life, I think, is lived at the boundaries. We move along on a razor's edge between the past and the future, and we need to learn to surf on that edge without sinking into either regret over a past we can't change or anxiety over a future we have only a little control over. We need to keep a sense of humor, a sense of perspective, and a sense of humility. There's an art, I think, to taking things just seriously enough. Life is both profoundly important and comically absurd at the same time. You are both the center of the universe, certainly from your own point of view, and an insignificant speck in the vastness of the cosmos at the same time. In 1927, Max Ehrmann composed the prose poem Desiderata, which became a pop culture phenomenon after a spoken word recording in 1971. Desiderata includes the lines, "You are a child of the universe, no less than the trees and the stars. You have a right to be here, and whether or not it is clear to you, no doubt the universe is unfolding as it should." In 1972, National Lampoon released a parody titled Deteriorata, containing the lines, "You are a fluke of the universe. You have no right to be here, and whether you can hear it or not, the universe is laughing behind your back." Child of the universe or fluke of the universe? Both? Neither? Does it really matter? You're here, and the universe is just going to have to deal with it. It's not about just throwing up our hands and giving in. We need to do what we can to try to make things better. There are things we have some control over and things we don't, and the trick is to direct our energies to the former and not obsess over the latter. Well, that's the second trick. The first trick is figuring out which is which. Worrying about things we can't control raises our stress levels to no good end. And as I've seen a few times on Facebook, choose your battles. No, that's too many battles, put some back. Adapting to change is something that humans are actually very good at, but it's hard work, even when it's good change. We need to take a break now and then. Toffler in Future Shock brought up the notion of stability zones as a way of dealing with relentless change. A stability zone is some aspect of your life that stays the same even while everything else around you is changing. He was pretty flexible with the definition, and he offered it more as an observation than a recommendation, but it's probably not a bad idea to find one or more stability zones in your life. Could be a relationship, or a pet or two or three to commune with, a daily ritual of almost any description, a room, a corner of a room, a favorite spot in a park or in the woods where you can just sit and meditate or ruminate. If you're practicing Zen, the one constant in your life might be working on coming to grips with the reality that nothing is constant. But what's life without a little irony? If, like me, you're retired or you otherwise have too much time on your hands, one thing I accidentally found works for me is to find a new hobby or activity that requires way more time and focus than you thought it would. Our recent decision to buy a camper turned into a bit of an obsession for several months, which kept me, at least in part, from overdosing on things like, say, the news. Fortunately, there are cheaper activities. Read, binge watch an old TV series. It's great if you have a productive hobby or interest to keep your mind off the outside world, but there's room for a little mindless escapism too. Learn to disengage a bit, especially if engaging means overdosing on bad news or obsessing over the latest polls or arguing with strangers on Facebook. We're heading into a scary and uncertain time, even more so than this year's been already. On the global and national scale, there's little we can do beyond casting our votes, crossing our fingers, and hoping it all works out somehow. But there's plenty that we can do locally within our own communities. Helping our friends and neighbors get through these times is probably the most effective and most rewarding use of our time and energy. As the old bumper sticker goes, think globally, act locally. And if you find yourself needing help, please reach out to someone. And I'm sorry about how depressing this talk may have been. I'll try to do something more uplifting next time. But meanwhile, I always close with this, but it seems especially appropriate these days. Life's hard, help each other through it, and try to leave it better than you found it. Thanks for listening.